Welcome to Chapter 2 of Introduction to Unity. In this video, we'll cover the essential topics for newcomers to Unity game development. Our objectives for today is to understand the concept of game objects and scenes in Unity. We will also learn about essential components like transform, sprite renderer, rigid body, colliders, and lighting. And by the end of this tutorial, you have a solid understanding of these fundamental concepts and be ready to implement these concepts into a simple 2D game project. We'll start by creating a new project and we will be choosing 2D URP. You can also choose 2D, but in this case, we will be choosing with the URP because we are implementing lighting in our game. First, let's discuss what is a game object. So a game object is a fundamental object type used to represent entities in a scene. It serves as a container for components which defines its behavior, appearance, and functionality. Essentially, game objects are the building blocks of a Unity scene, representing everything from characters and props to lights and cameras. And the next one is scene. A scene is a collection of game objects, assets, and other elements that make up a specific level, environment, or portion of a game. Scenes help organize and manage different parts of a game, such as menus, levels, or cutscenes, by allowing developers to load and unload them as needed during gameplay. To create a new game object, go to the Game Object menu and select the desired type. And to manipulate a game object in the scene view, select it and use the Move, Rotate, and Scale tool from the toolbar. And to create a new scene, go to Scene window, right-click, Create, and click Scene. You can switch between scenes by selecting it. Next, we will discuss the basic components of the game object. First is transform component, which is one of the most fundamental components in Unity. The transform component determines the position, rotation, and scale of a game object. The transform component is visible in the inspector window when a game object is selected. You can modify these values by typing in the fields or using the provided handles in the scene view. Next is Sprite Renderer. It is used to display 2D graphics in your game. It's commonly used for characters, background, and other visual elements. You can assign a sprite image to the sprite renderer component or change its colors to define the appearance of the game object. Now let's try to run it in the game view. And here you can see that the game object is static and it's not moving. So we want the object to be moving. So let's try to add gravity into it. Go back to the scene view. And before we apply gravity, let's discuss what is a rigid body component. So a rigid body is used to simulate physics behavior for game objects. It allows game objects to respond to forces like gravity, collisions, and applied forces. When a rigid body is attached to a game object, it becomes subject to Unity's physics simulation. Using rigid body is essential for creating dynamic and realistic interactions in your game. And now let's apply a rigid body component into the game object. Go to the inspector window, add component, search for rigid body. Specifically, we will be applying rigid body 2D since we are using a 2D template. Let's try to run it. Now that gravity is applied, we need something to catch the object. This is done by applying a box collider component. But first, let's have an overview of what a box collider is. Box collider component is essential for implementing physical response and interaction in your game. It is used to define the shape of a game object for collision detection. Before we apply box collision, let's first create a platform. Now let's apply box collider. The same goes for the platform. Mm, Now let's run it. Here we can see that the platform catches the falling object above due to the collision detection being applied between the two objects. Additionally, you can also change the parameters of the box collider by going through the edit collider, and you will notice the 4 points for the parameters of the box collider, and also adjust this to however you see fit. And the last component that we will be discussing in this video will be the lighting component. Lighting in Unity is essential in setting moods and atmosphere of your game. Understanding how to use lighting effectively can greatly improve the visual appeal of your game. Before we apply lighting into our game, let's first set up the settings for the lighting. Now, let's create an asset called URP asset. Go to create, rendering, and then URP asset with 2D renderer. Just name it light. And now we will go to the edit, project settings, and for the scriptable render pipeline settings, you will drag this one to there, then continue. And now we will add some lighting into it. First, we will go to the hierarchy window, right click, create, and then create light, create global light 2D. And to see the difference if lighting is applied, you can go over here at the top and toggle this on. Then we go back to the light object, change its intensity, make it darker. And then we will add another lighting. This time it is spotlight 2D. And here you can see that the lighting is visible and it is drag around the object. You can also change its settings, the intensity, the inner, the outer radius, the inner outer spot angle, and the fall-up strength. Now let's try to create some normal lightings for our object. And if you want to duplicate the object, just hold Control and then D, duplicate it. Then we run it. Now you see that the lighting is applied into the game. Now, whenever you're creating an environment for your game and you want to incorporate scenery, you can always add lighting object and adjust their property settings. It is important to note that when applying lighting into your game, this is only achievable when creating a template with URP alongside with it. So when we go back to the Unity Hub and creating a new project, you need to have uh, URP. This also applies with 3D if you're creating a 3D game. But when you are applying lighting elements, you should use 2D URP. And that's about it for this video's tutorial. We've covered the game objects, scenes, and basic components like transform, sprite renderer, rigid body, colliders, and lighting. And for the next video, we'll be discussing about the scripts.